You think you know a good ghost story. You think you know what darkness looks like. You don't know the Ozarks. In 1882, the Ozark Mountains weren't a place you visited for the scenery. They were a prison of endless trees, deep hollers, and crushing isolation. This was a land just healing from the Civil War, but the scars here ran deeper than any battlefield. They were in the soil, in the water, and in the people. Families lived miles apart, separated by forests so thick the sun barely touched the ground. News traveled by horseback, if it traveled at all. It was the perfect place to get lost. It was the perfect place to disappear. And that's exactly what happened to the Caldwell sisters. This is the story of Margaret and Eleanor, and it's one of the most disturbing cases in American history. A mystery that starts with two girls in a wagon and ends in a place so dark most people can't even stand to hear about it. Margaret was 23. She was the practical one, the one who helped her father, Thomas Caldwell, run the family hardware store in Marshfield, Missouri. Her hands were calloused. Her hair was always tied back tight. She was the rock. Eleanor was 19, and she was the dreamer. She had restless eyes, always looking past the tree line, wondering about big cities and a life that wasn't covered in dust and hardship. Their mother had been taken by typhoid 3 years earlier, leaving the three of them to hold the world together. Thomas adored them. He protected them with the kind of ferocity only a man who's already lost half his world can have. On October 27th, 1882, a letter arrived. It was from their Aunt Sarah, their mother's sister, over in Springfield, about 50 miles south. The letter said Sarah was sick, really sick, and she was asking for her nieces to come. It was a 2-day trip by wagon, a common enough journey, but one that required an overnight stay at an inn along the way. Thomas didn't like it, not one bit. The roads were just muddy tracks, and robberies weren't just common. They were expected. He didn't want his girls out there alone, but Margaret, ever practical, insisted. They knew the route. They'd stop in Seymour before nightfall. It was their duty to go. Reluctantly, Thomas agreed. He prepped the wagon himself, checked every wheel, packed enough food for 3 days. He gave them a small leather bag of silver coins. His final words were a warning. Don't talk to strangers. Don't stop for anyone. And don't, under any circumstances, leave the main road. On the morning of October 28th, under a sky the color of a fresh bruise, Margaret and Eleanor Caldwell set out. They wore their best wool capes and wide-brimmed hats. Several people in Marshfield waved as they rattled past. No one knew it was the last time they'd be seen, or at least the last time anyone would admit to seeing them. The road to Springfield was a serpent, twisting through valleys so narrow the sun was a stranger. It was a treacherous, beautiful path. They were supposed to reach Seymour, the halfway point, by dusk. The owner of the boarding house there, Jeremiah Walsh, knew the girls. He kept a room for them. But as night fell on the 28th, the room stayed empty. Walsh waited, watching the road, but the Caldwell sisters never arrived. In Springfield, Aunt Sarah waited. The 29th came and went, then the 30th. By November 1st, she was sick with worry, not just fever. She sent a telegram to Marshfield. It took 2 days to arrive. When Thomas Caldwell read that single terrifying message, girls never arrived. Are they home? His world simply fell apart. They were gone. Disappeared somewhere in that 50-mile stretch of wilderness. It had been 6 days. 6 days. Thomas didn't wait for a sheriff. He saddled his fastest horse and rode like a madman, retracing the route his daughters had taken. Despair was a hammer in his chest. The nights were already freezing. If they were out there, lost, how long could they last? He rode all the way to Seymour, the horse foaming, and burst into Jeremiah Walsh's boarding house. Walsh confirmed his worst fear. They never got here, Thomas. I waited all night. The news spread through the tiny town like a sickness. Everyone knew the Caldwell girls. How could two smart, capable women just vanish? This is when the first terrible twist in the story appeared. A farmer named Cornelius Black, a man with a beard as gray as the sky, spoke up. He'd traveled that same road north from Springfield on the same day the girls went missing. He left at dawn and got to Seymour by mid-afternoon. If the sisters had left Marshfield in the morning, they should have crossed paths. He should have seen them. But he hadn't. He hadn't seen their wagon, hadn't seen two women, hadn't seen anything. It meant they hadn't just been delayed. It meant something had stopped them, and it had stopped them fast. But as the men gathered, another voice cut through the panic. A grimy fur trapper, a man named Silas Croft, spit a wad of tobacco onto the muddy street. "I seen 'em," he grunted. The crowd went silent. "Saw 'em just north of the Gasconade River crossing. They wasn't alone." Thomas's heart stopped. "What do you mean? Who were they with?" Silas squinted, enjoying the attention. "Two fellas, fancy buggy, looked like city folk. The girls they was talking to 'em, laughing. Then they all turned, headed east." East? Not south to Springfield? The men looked at each other. A cold, awful thought entered their minds. What if this wasn't an abduction? What if it was an elopement? Eleanor, with her restless eyes dreaming of big cities, Thomas was furious. "My daughters would never—" "Maybe not," Silas sneered. "But I saw what I saw. They took the old logging road, heading toward Laclede County." Thomas was torn. The farmer, Black, said he saw nothing on the main road. This trapper, Silas, claimed to have seen them veering off on a different path. It was a lead. It was something against his better judgment, against the protests of Cornelius Black, who thought the trapper was a known liar. Thomas made a choice. "Show us," he commanded. For an entire day they followed Silas on a wild goose chase. They rode 20 miles east, deep into rugged country, wasting precious time. They found the old logging road. They found nothing, no wheel tracks, no sign of a buggy, no sign of his girls. By dusk on November 3rd, Thomas grabbed the trapper by his greasy coat. "You're lying," he hissed. Silas just smiled, showing yellow teeth. "Maybe I am, maybe I ain't. What's it worth to you?" Thomas didn't have time for this. He'd been tricked. But why? Why would someone intentionally send them the wrong way? It was a question he couldn't answer. All he knew was that he had just lost another 24 hours. And in the freezing Ozarks, 24 hours was a death sentence. A dejected, furious search party returned to Seymour. It was dawn on November 4th. They had nothing. Thomas was broken. But as they stood in the cold morning light, another man stepped forward. His name was Peter Hutchkins. He was young, with eyes that looked like they'd seen hell and come back. "My sister vanished on that same road 7 years ago," he said, his voice flat. "They said she ran off. They said it was bandits. They said a lot of things. They never looked." He pulled a long hunting knife from his belt. "I've been looking ever since. Let's check the main road again, but this time we look for what's off the road." This time the search was different. It wasn't just a rescue. It was an excavation. Thomas, Cornelius Black, Peter Hutchkins, and a dozen other men rode out, but this time they moved slow. Their eyes weren't on the road ahead, but on the ditches, the brush, the breaks in the trees. It was Peter Hutchkins who found it, 10 miles north of Seymour. He just stopped. He pointed. There. At first, Thomas couldn't see it, just mud and leaves. Then he saw what Peter saw. The faint, almost invisible impression of a wagon wheel. But it wasn't on the road. It was leaving it, heading straight into a dense, dark patch of forest where no trail existed. Why would they go in there? They followed the tracks on foot. The forest was ancient, the trees thick, the silence absolute. It was the kind of place that felt like it was watching you. A kilometer in, the tracks just ended, and then they found the wagon. It was on its side in a small, damp clearing. One wheel was snapped off the axle. The provisions Thomas had so carefully packed were scattered, moldy, and half-eaten by animals. The leather bag with the silver coins was there, slit open and empty. But the horses were gone, and the hitching belts hadn't been unbuckled. They'd been cut. A robber would take the money, maybe the horses, but they wouldn't drag a wagon a kilometer into the woods to do it. This was something else. This was personal. Then Thomas saw it. A flash of dark wool snagged on a thorn bush. He ripped it free. It was Eleanor's cloak, torn, muddy, and cold. This wasn't an elopement. This wasn't a robbery. This was an ambush. The men fanned out, shouting the girls' names, their voices swallowed by the trees. Nothing. Hutchkins found Margaret's shoe, half buried in the mud near the wagon. It looked like it had been ripped from her foot. The silence of the group was heavier than the fog rolling in. They all knew what this meant. Something terrible had happened here. Cornelius Black, the old farmer, was staring at the tracks leading away from the wagon. They weren't wheel tracks anymore. They were boot prints. Large ones. A single set. And drag marks. 2 of them. Black's face went pale. "I know this place," he whispered. The other men leaned in. "The old-timers, they talk about this patch of woods. There's a cabin, about a mile north of here, belonged to an old hermit, died years ago." Hutchkins spat. "So it's an empty cabin?" "No," Black said, his eyes wide. "That's just it. People say it ain't empty. They say he never left. Travelers report things, lights, sounds, a feeling of being watched. Thomas Caldwell didn't care about ghost stories. If there's a roof, we check it," he said, his voice like iron. They followed the boot prints. The trail was easy to follow. The man who made it hadn't bothered to cover his tracks. He was either arrogant or he just didn't care. The forest got denser, darker. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches like skeletal fingers. After an hour of hard hiking, they saw it through the gloom. The cabin. It was a ruin. The roof was half collapsed, the walls covered in vines, but the men stopped dead. There was smoke, a thin gray tendril of it curling from the crumbling stone chimney. Someone was home. Hutchkins and Thomas drew their pistols. The other men grabbed their rifles. They moved in slow, surrounding the cabin. The smell was awful. Rot, mildew, and something else, something meaty. "Come out!" Thomas shouted, his voice cracking. "We're armed." Silence. Only the wind whistling through the broken boards. Hutchkins kicked the door. It wasn't a door anymore, just rotten planks hanging on one hinge. It fell into the gloom with a wet slap. Thomas and Hutchkins plunged in, lanterns held high. The inside was a nightmare. The floor was covered in filth, dead leaves, and animal droppings. In the corner, a small, weak fire smoldered in the fireplace. There were old ropes with dark, rusty stains, empty bottles, and bones. Small animal bones, mostly, but some looked unsettlingly different. But there was no one there. The fire was recent, but the occupant was gone. "He must have heard us coming," one of the men said from the doorway, and slipped out the back. "There is no back," Hutchkins said, kicking at the filth. "Only this." And then Peter Hutchkins found it, stuck on a rusty nail in the wall, as if torn in a struggle. A small blue scrap of fabric. Thomas didn't need to be told. He snatched it. It was from Margaret's blue travel dress. The one she'd been so proud of. They were here. They had been dragged here. The men tore the cabin apart. They looked for a root cellar, a trapdoor, anything, nothing, just filth. And the ghost of that terrible smell. "The trail's cold," one man said, his spirit breaking. "He's gone. They're gone." "No," Thomas said. He was on his knees, holding the scrap of fabric. He was a broken man. It was then that August Weber, another searcher, spoke up. "The tracks end here, but a man can't fly." He pointed to the still smoldering fire. "Whoever he is, he can't be far. I've got my hounds back at the farm. Scent hounds. If we give 'em something the girls owned, it was a long shot." The trail was days old, and it had rained, but it was all they had. Weber rode like a demon back to his farm, while the other men waited in the grim silence of that cursed cabin, the smell of the place clinging to them like a shroud. Weber returned 3 hours later with 3 massive hounds, their ears dragging in the mud. They were beasts built for one purpose: to find what didn't want to be found. Weber gave them Eleanor's muddy cloak to scent. The dogs sniffed it, whined, and then they went wild. They didn't just pick up a trail, they bolted. The men had to run to keep up. The dogs weren't tracking a man, they were tracking terror. They ran past the cabin, not even pausing, and plunged deeper into the Ozark wilderness, in a direction no one ever went. Southeast, into a region of steep ravines and limestone cliffs. For 2 miles they ran. The Mentables crashing through brush, horses struggling. The trees here were different, gnarled, ancient, and covered in pale, hanging moss. The dogs led them down a steep incline to the edge of a narrow, icy stream, and then they stopped. The hounds just sat down. They whined, their snouts to the ground, but they would not go further. They tucked their tails between their legs and stared at the opposite bank of the stream, at a wall of dark, moss-covered rock. "What is it, boy?" Weber cooed, trying to urge them forward. The lead dog just whimpered and tried to back away. "They're spooked," Cornelius Black muttered. "Animals, they know things we don't. This is a bad place." Thomas didn't care. He waded into the freezing water, pistol in hand, and crossed to the other side. Peter Hutchkins was right behind him. The bank was soft mud, and it was covered in tracks, the same heavy boot prints from the cabin, and the drag marks. The tracks led straight to the rock wall, which wasn't a solid wall. It was a cave, dozens of them. The limestone cliff was pockmarked with dark, narrow openings like mouths waiting to swallow them whole. The boot prints led directly into the largest, blackest opening. A cold dread, worse than the stream water, settled on Thomas. The dogs wouldn't go near it. The men looked at each other, their breath fogging in the air. This was a grave. They all knew it. "We need more light," Thomas said, his voice hollow. They lit torches, lanterns. Thomas, Hutchkins, Black, and 3 other men prepared to go in. The rest would stay with the horses and the terrified dogs. Thomas took the first step into the darkness. The air that hit him was cold, damp, and smelled of the grave. It smelled like the cabin, but 1,000 times worse. They advanced into the black. The only sound was their own breathing and the constant, maddening drip, drip, drip of water from the ceiling. The tunnel was narrow, the walls slick with moisture. Their lanterns cast shadows that danced like demons on the walls. They called the girls' names. "Margaret! Eleanor!" Only the echo answered, twisting their voices into something horrible. The tunnel branched. Then it branched again. A labyrinth. They were just guessing, following the most worn path. They were maybe 100 yards in, the world of sunlight and trees a distant memory, when Thomas's foot kicked something. It wasn't a rock. It was soft. He lowered his lantern. His heart, which he thought had stopped hours ago, broke all over again. It was a book. A small leather-bound prayer book. The cover was soaked, the pages warped. But on the inside cover, in his late wife's elegant handwriting, was a name: Eleanor Marie Caldwell. She had been here. She had been dragged here, and she had dropped this, maybe as a sign, maybe in a struggle. Thomas clutched the book to his chest and pushed forward, a new cold fury burning in his veins. He wasn't a father anymore. He was an executioner. The tunnel descended sharply. The air grew colder. They had to walk in single file, the walls pressing in. And then it opened up. They were in a chamber. A huge chamber. The ceiling was so high their lanterns couldn't find it. Stalactites hung down like stone teeth. And in the center there was a camp. The remains of a fire, extinguished for days. A pile of filthy, crude animal skins for a bed, empty food cans, and a smell that made the men gag. It was the smell of old smoke, spoiled meat, and something else, something chemical and sharp. Peter Hutchkins, his eyes scanning every shadow, was the first to see it. Thomas, over here. He was pointing at the wall. Thomas brought his lantern closer. The wall was covered in scratches, hundreds of them, vertical lines carved into the stone, grouped in sets of 5, with a line through them. Someone had been counting the days. Thomas's hand trembled as he counted a group. 63, he whispered. There are 63 marks here. Cornelius Black did the math. Thomas, your girls have been missing for a week. The horror of it settled on them. Whoever had been trapped here, counting the days, it wasn't Margaret. It wasn't Eleanor. They weren't the first. The thought hit Thomas like a physical blow. This thing had been doing this for months, maybe years. All those travelers who vanished. All those stories the town elders dismissed as folklore. They weren't stories. They were warnings. And then Cornelius Black found the pile. In a dark corner, hidden behind a rock, was a mound of things. He kicked it with his boot. Clothes. Torn, stained, rotting clothes. Shoes of all different sizes. Crumpled hats. Empty bags. Hunting trophies. Black used a stick to turn the pile over. A silver brooch with the initials GH. A pair of spectacles, one lens cracked. A pocket watch, stopped at 3:15. And at the bottom, yellowed and stained with dark rusty splotches, a full wedding dress. The men stood in stunned, horrified silence. This wasn't a cabin. It was a lair. This wasn't a man. It was a spider. And they had just walked into his web. How many? How many lives had ended in this cold, dark place? But they hadn't found the girls. And this chamber wasn't the end. On the far side, another tunnel opened up. This one even darker and narrower than the first. Thomas approached it. He raised his lantern, and he listened. Over the sound of his own heart, over the drip, 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 there was another sound. Faint. So faint he thought he was imagining it. A whimper. He held his breath. There it was again. Help! It was a woman's voice. Margaret! Thomas roared, his voice cracking. Eleanor! He didn't wait for the others. He plunged into the new tunnel. It was a squeeze, forcing him to turn sideways, the rocks scraping his shoulders. The others were right behind him. Thomas, wait! It could be a trap! I don't care! He yelled back. The tunnel twisted, descended. The air was foul. They pushed on, driven by that one faint sound. Then the tunnel opened up again. A new chamber. This one was smaller, but there was a light, a faint bluish glow from a crack high in the ceiling. Daylight. They were near the surface again, but somewhere else, somewhere different, and huddled against the far wall a human figure. Thomas ran, stumbling over the rocks. He raised his lantern. It was a woman, or what was left of one. She was in rags, her hair matted, her feet bare and bloody. Her eyes were wide with terror, but it wasn't Margaret, and it wasn't Eleanor. Thomas knelt beside her. It's okay, he said, his voice gentle. We're here to help. The woman just whimpered and curled into a ball. Cornelius Black offered his canteen. She drank like an animal, water spilling down her chin. When she could finally speak, her voice was a dry rattle. He comes back. He always comes back. You can't be here. Who? Thomas demanded. Who did this? But the woman just shook her head, her eyes darting to the tunnel they'd just come through, as if expecting the monster to appear. It was Hutchkins who saw the rest of the room. He raised his lantern. My God, he whispered. Against the far wall, driven deep into the limestone, were iron hooks, and from the hooks chains long enough to move, but not to escape. One chain was empty, the cuff at the end open. The other chain, however, was not. It led to a dark shape huddled in the deepest shadow. "Thomas," Hutchkins said, his voice shaking. "There's someone else." Thomas rushed over. He raised his light. The dark shape was a person, curled in a fetal position. He recognized the dark green travel dress, now torn to shreds. "Margaret!" He fell to his knees beside his daughter. He turned her over. She was unconscious, but she was breathing. Her pulse was weak, a faint bird flutter against his fingers. There was a large, ugly gash on her forehead, matted with dried blood. Her hands were ice cold. Cornelius Black was already at the chain, smashing the rusty cuff with a rock. With a final agonizing shriek of metal, Margaret was free. Thomas lifted his eldest daughter into his arms, tears of rage and relief streaming down his face. He had one. He had one. "Where is Eleanor?" he roared, turning to the other woman. "Where is my other daughter?" The woman was shaking violently. He took her," she stammered. "The new one, the young one. He took her 2 days ago, maybe 3. She pointed to another dark hole in the wall. A tunnel they hadn't seen, hidden by a fold in the rock. "Where?" Thomas demanded. "Where did he take her?" "Deeper," the woman whispered, her eyes rolling back. "He always takes the new ones deeper. To the river, where no one can hear them scream. I heard her for 2 days, and then just silence." Thomas felt the cave spin. He passed Margaret's limp body to Cornelius Black. "Get them out," he ordered, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "Get Margaret and this woman out of here. Back to the entrance. Fire your guns 3 times when you're clear." "Thomas, you're not," Black started. "Get them out," Thomas roared. Black looked at the man's eyes and saw a father had been replaced by something primal. He just nodded. "We'll wait for you at the first chamber." As Black and the others half carried, half dragged the 2 women back, Thomas turned to the last man, Peter Hutchkins. Hutchkins hadn't moved. He was just staring at the empty chain, the one with the open cuff. His face was a mask of unreadable grief. 7 years, he whispered. "Was she here? Did she count the days?" "Peter," Thomas said gently. Hutchkins looked up and his eyes were clear, and they were full of hate. "He took my sister. He took your daughter. Let's go get her back." The 2 men, a father and a ghost, checked their pistols, lit fresh torches, and walked into the 3rd tunnel. The one that led deeper, the tunnel went down. Not a gentle slope. It went down. The walls were slick, not with damp, but with slime. The air was so cold it burned their lungs, and the sound was growing. A low, steady roar, running water, an underground river, just as the woman had said. They descended for what felt like an eternity. Time lost all meaning. There was only the scrape of their boots, the hiss of their torches, and the growing roar of the river. The air was thick with mist and the smell, that same awful, rotten, sweet smell. Then the tunnel ended. It didn't just open into a chamber, it opened into hell. The cave was massive, so big, their light didn't find the walls. It was a subterranean cathedral, and in the center, lit by a half-dozen guttering torches stuck in the rock, was the river. It was black, fast and violent, crashing through the cavern with a deafening noise. The roar of the water had covered their approach, and he hadn't heard them. On the bank of the river, on a large flat rock, was a figure, a man. He was huge, dressed in what looked like patches of animal skin sewn together. His hair was a matted, filthy curtain that fell to his shoulders. He was bent over something on the rock, something small. Hutchkins grabbed Thomas's arm, his fingers like a vice. "Wait." The man was muttering, chanting, words they couldn't understand, lost in the roar of the water. He was performing some ritual, and then he stepped aside. And Thomas saw her, Eleanor. She was tied to the flat rock, her arms and legs bound with thick rope. Her blue dress was in tatters. She was pale, so pale, and she was motionless. Thomas felt the world go red. The fury that had been simmering in his gut exploded. He didn't care about plans. He didn't care about traps. He broke free from Hutchkins' grip and charged, screaming a sound that wasn't human. It was a primal roar of a father who had found the monster. The man spun around, surprised, and for the first time Thomas saw his face. It was a nightmare. Sunken eyes that glowed with a sick, yellow light, a beard caked with filth, and a smile, a slow, awful smile that split his face, revealing rotten, broken teeth. "More visitors," the man's voice croaked, surprisingly calm. "The mountain provides. The river accepts." Thomas didn't say a word. He flew at him, but the man, for all his size, was fast. He sidestepped Thomas's lunge, grabbed him by the coat, and threw him against the cave wall like a rag doll. Thomas's head hit the rock. The world exploded in white-hot pain. He felt the air leave his lungs. The man was on him in an instant, his huge, filthy hands closing around Thomas's throat. "The river is hungry," he hissed, his breath a wave of rot. "It's time to feed her." Thomas clawed at the hands, but it was like trying to break steel. His vision was going dark. "No!" Peter Hutchkins, he'd grabbed one of the torches from the wall. He swung it like a club, smashing it into the man's back. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of pain, as the fire caught, his greasy clothes instantly igniting. He let go of Thomas and spun, roaring, swatting at the flames on his back. Thomas gasped for air, his throat on fire. Hutchkins stood his ground, holding the torch like a sword. "Get Eleanor!" he shouted. Thomas scrambled to his feet. He ran to the rock. Eleanor's eyes were open, but they were vacant, staring at the cave ceiling. "Eleanor, baby, it's Daddy!" He fumbled with the ropes, his hands bloody and shaking. They were wet and knotted tight. Behind him the fight was on. The man, his back smoking and smoldering, was grappling with Hutchkins. "You don't understand!" the man shrieked, his voice echoing. "I saved them! The world up there, it's poison. The fire took my family. The city, they cast me out. But the mountain she took me in, she sends them to me." He was completely, terrifyingly insane. He was stronger than Hutchkins. He knocked the torch from his hand, sending it skittering into the darkness. He grabbed Hutchkins and lifted him off the ground. Thomas got the first rope on Eleanor's hand free. He didn't have a knife. He was tearing at the knots with his teeth. "I purify them," the man screamed, "and the river takes them home." He was marching Hutchkins toward the black churning water. "Peter!" Thomas yelled. Hutchkins, his feet dangling, did the only thing he could. He drove his thumbs hard into the man's eyes. The man shrieked. It was a sound of pure agony. He dropped Hutchkins, clutching his face. He was blind, at least for a moment, stumbling, roaring in pain. Hutchkins scrambled away. "Get her, Thomas! Go!" But the man, blinded and burning, wasn't done. He was sniffing the air. He turned, his head cocked toward Eleanor. "No," he whispered, "not this one. She is mine." He started lurching, not toward Thomas, not toward Hutchkins, but toward the rock. Toward Eleanor. Thomas threw himself in front of his daughter. "You'll have to kill me first." The man stopped. The smile returned, even on his ruined face. Blood streamed from his eyes. "Yes," he said, "yes. The river accepts all." He lunged. Thomas met him. They crashed to the slick, rocky ground, rolling, punching, gouging. The man was a demon, all wiry strength and mad fury. He wasn't human. He didn't feel pain. He got his hands back on Thomas's throat. Thomas was losing. The man was too strong. He was pressing down, his full weight on Thomas's chest. "You see?" The man gurgled, blood and spittle flying from his mouth. It's so easy to sleep. Thomas's vision was fading. He saw Eleanor, then his wife, then Clink. His hand, flailing, had hit something metal on the rock. He fumbled for it. His fingers closed around it. Hutchkins' knife. He must have dropped it. With the last bit of strength in his body, Thomas Caldwell rammed the hunting knife deep into the monster's side. The man froze. The hands on his throat went limp. He looked down at the hilt of the knife sticking out from his ribs. He looked confused. But I am the shepherd. He slumped forward, his full dead weight collapsing on Thomas. Thomas pushed the body off, gasping. He was covered in the man's blood. He turned to Eleanor. Hutchkins was already there, cutting the last of her ropes. "She's alive," Hutchkins said, his voice thick. "Just weak. We need to get her out." Thomas crawled to his daughter. "Eleanor, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered. They focused. A single tear rolled down her dirty cheek. "Daddy," she whispered. He hugged her. He held her. And for a full minute the only sound was the roar of the river, the man's body lying in a heap, and the sobbing of a father who had just come back from hell. "It's over," Thomas whispered, rocking her. "It's all over." But it wasn't. Because as Hutchkins helped Thomas lift Eleanor, a new sound cut through the cavern. A low, terrified moan. It hadn't come from them. Hutchkins and Thomas froze. They looked into the shadows past the ring of torchlight. The cavern was huge, and they weren't alone. "Who's there?" Hutchkins called out, raising the knife. The moan came again from the far wall. Thomas grabbed a torch. He and Hutchkins walked slowly, supporting Eleanor between them, and they saw the cages, 3 of them, made of crude wood and wire, and they were occupied. In the first cage was a young woman with fiery red hair, so pale she was almost translucent. She was unconscious, or maybe in the second cage was the first woman they'd rescued, Catherine Morton. She must have been dragged back down. She was curled in a ball, just shaking. And in the third cage, another woman, emaciated, her eyes wide and vacant. He had more, Hutchkins breathed. He had a flock. They freed the other women. The red-haired girl was breathing, but just barely. The third woman, she didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stared. The trauma had broken her. They had 5 survivors: Margaret, Eleanor, Catherine, the redhead, and the woman with no name, 2 men, and a long, long climb back to the surface. The journey out of that cave was a silent, shuffling nightmare. It took hours. They had to half carry the weakest women. Thomas carried Eleanor, refusing to let her go. Hutchkins carried the red-haired girl. The others helped Catherine and the silent woman. When they finally staggered back into the first chamber, Cornelius Black and the other men stared in disbelief. They had expected 2 men or 2 bodies. They got an exodus. When they emerged from the mouth of the cave, into the setting sun, the men outside, they took off their hats. It was like watching ghosts walk out of the earth. Margaret was there, conscious now, wrapped in blankets. When she saw Eleanor, she let out a sob of such profound relief and pain that it made the hardened frontiersmen weep. The sisters collapsed into each other's arms, their nightmare finally almost over. The journey back to Seymour was slow. They were a procession of the damned. Dr. William Garrett was called. He set to work, his face grim. Margaret had a severe concussion. Eleanor had hypothermia, infected wounds, and severe malnutrition. Catherine Morton, she was physically stable, but her mind was gone. She sat in a chair staring at the wall for 3 days. The red-haired girl, she never woke up. The infections, the cold, the starvation, it was too much. She died 2 days later, without ever telling them her name. She was buried in the Seymour Cemetery under a simple stone that read, "Unknown woman found Nov 5, 1882. Rest in peace." The woman with the vacant eyes, she was identified as Sarah Whitmore. She'd been missing for 4 months. The story exploded. Sheriff Edmund Price arrived from Marshfield. He listened to Thomas's story, his face turning to granite. He organized a real expedition. A dozen armed men descended back into that hell. What they found, it was worse than they imagined. They explored every tunnel. They found the man's living quarters. They found his Bible. The margins were filled with his mad scribblings, a twisted theology. He wasn't killing them. He was purifying them. He believed the mountain was a god, and the river was its baptism. They found more bones, so many. They found a list carved into a piece of tanned hide, a list of names, 47 of them, and the pile of trophies. It was brought to the Marshfield Baptist Church. Sheriff Price put out the word, and the families came. They called it the Hall of Sorrows. For a week, a parade of broken-hearted people walked past those tables piled with the belongings of the lost. An old woman from Camden County who recognized a silver brooch. "It was my Grace," she wept. "Missing 8 years." A farmer who saw a familiar pocket watch. "My brother. He and his fiancée, 1877. The fiancé of the woman in the wedding dress, he was an old man now. He'd been the prime suspect for 14 years. He just stood, holding the rotten lace, and sobbed. His name finally cleared at a price too terrible to imagine. The investigation confirmed at least 23 separate victims spanning 15 years. The man, they never found out his name. The fire he'd mentioned, the town that cast him out. It was all a mystery. His body, like so many of his victims, was never recovered. The river had taken him. The caves were sealed. They used dynamite. They blew the entrances, collapsing the tunnels, turning that underground cathedral of horrors into a tomb. Thomas Caldwell sold everything. He couldn't stay. He couldn't even look at the mountains. He took Margaret and Eleanor and moved north, far away to flat land, where the sky was big and you could see for miles. Eleanor never married. She became a school teacher, pouring her life into children. Margaret did marry, a quiet widower. She had children of her own, and she never, ever let them out of her sight. Catherine Morton, the woman they rescued, lived her last years in an asylum, whispering about a man in the dark and a river that was always calling. Peter Hutchkins, after the cave was sealed, he just walked away. He was last seen heading back into the Ozarks, his hunting knife on his belt, still looking for his sister's grave. He was never seen again. The Ozarks kept their secrets. The story faded from fact into folklore, a ghost story to tell kids, the caveman of the Ozarks. But there's one last chilling detail, a detail that Sheriff Price never put in his official report. On the day they sealed the cave, February 1883, after the last charge was set and the dust began to settle, the men were packing up. Price was the last one to leave. He was turning to go when he saw it. There, in the fresh mud, not 10 feet from the blasted sealed entrance, was a footprint, a single, fresh boot print, large, deep. Price stared at it. His blood ran cold. It was impossible. The man was dead. The cave was sealed. He looked around. The other men were already heading down the trail. He was alone. "Impossible," he muttered. He scuffed the print out with his own boot, destroying the evidence, but as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling. The man was dead. His body was gone. But what if the evil had just found a new home? If this journey into one of America's darkest forgotten stories touched you, and if you believe these lost voices deserve to be heard, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We tell the stories that history tries to forget. And in the comments, let me know, do you think the nightmare ended when they sealed the cave? Or is there still something waiting in the dark, in the heart of those mountains? Until next time, stay safe and check your locks.